Chapter 5. That which isn't in books, life will teach you. Mexican proverb. Sylvia, Westminster, California. Sylvia had looked all over the farm for her father before she finally found him behind the big barn. He was turning the tractor engine with the help of Mr. Ortega, one of the men who worked for him. For weeks, that big Alice Chalmers Model B tractor had been sputtering and hacking, sometimes coughing out smoke until it stalled out completely. Mom says that the other men have finished dinner, Sylvia said. She wants to know if you want to eat. Okay, her father said. We're almost finished here. Mr. Ortega turned the key in the ignition, and the engine started right away. It rumbled, loud but steady. It's the timing, Mr. Ortega said. Hear that? Now she's nice and even, just the right mix of fuel and air. Sylvia's father smiled. I can't thank you enough, he said, closing the repair manual. Please join us for dinner, and let me take you home. It's getting late. About a dozen of the men who worked on the Mendez farm stayed in the farm's bunkhouse, but Mr. Ortega and several others lived in the barrio. He usually caught a ride with the other workers to and from the farm, but everyone else had already left for home. After washing up, Mr. Ortega joined Sylvia's father at the dining room table in the main house. Sylvia's mother brought them each a large bowl of steaming chili con carne. I think my daughter, Sylvia, is in class with one of your children, Sylvia's father said after swallowing his first bite. Sylvia was in the kitchen washing plates, but she perked up when she heard her name. She could just see Mr. Ortega from the sink. Don't your children go to the Hoover School? Her father prompted Mr. Ortega. Pablo and Sonia go to school there, Mr. Ortega said, wiping the edge of his mouth with a napkin. My oldest son, he is at Camp San Luis Obispo, 40th Infantry Division. You must be very proud of him, Sylvia's mother said, putting a platter of cornbread on the table. I am. Sylvia knew what was coming next. Her father couldn't pass up an opportunity to try to convince the parents of Hoover students to sign his petition. Superintendent Harris had never followed up about switching Sylvia and her brothers to Westminster School, so her father had organized the Asociación de Padres de Niños Mexico-Americanos, the Association of Parents of Mexican-American Children. As her father talked about segregation in the schools, a term Sylvia was hearing a lot lately, Mr. Ortega remained quiet, looking down at his chili. Separating our children by the color of their skin is wrong, her father said. The children should go to school together, don't you think? Mr. Ortega glanced up at Sylvia's father, nodding in agreement, but indicating that his mouth was too full to speak. Sylvia watched intently, suspected he didn't want to get into an argument with his host. So, would you be willing to sign a letter to the school board? Her father asked. Mr. Ortega swallowed. Sign a letter? Oh, no, he said unhappily, shaking his head. I can't do that. It's a simple letter, Sylvia's father explained. It just asks for better schools. I don't want trouble, said Mr. Ortega. I don't want trouble either, Sylvia's father said reasonably, but I want my children to get a good education. Sylvia felt sorry for Mr. Ortega. What could he possibly say to that? Think about it, Sylvia's father said. Your son is risking his life for his country, while his little brother can't go to a school with his white neighbors. I know, Mr. Ortega agreed, sounding miserable. But we can't change the school system. If we complain, all we get is trouble. I don't know about trouble, Sylvia's father answered, his voice sounding hard-edged, but I do know that we won't get anything if we don't ask. For a few minutes, an awkward silence separated the two men. At last, Mr. Ortega murmured, I'm sorry, I really am, but I can't. Sylvia's father sighed. I understand. I wish things were different, but I understand. Sylvia's mother began gathering up the last of the dishes. Sylvia, help me clear the table, then finish your homework and off to bed. Sylvia had so many questions, but she kept quiet and dutifully helped her mother carry the plates and silverware out to the kitchen. The following morning at breakfast, Sylvia asked her father, why wouldn't Mr. Ortega sign the letter? He was afraid. So many people are afraid of challenging the school board. Why? Sylvia asked. Some people worry that if they speak out for change, they will lose their jobs or get sent back to Mexico. Some people want their children to go to Hoover because it's near the barrio. He let out a heartfelt sigh. The only life they see for their children is the life they have lived themselves, working at low-paying jobs, having children too young, never speaking up, being certain that the future can only be like the past. Sylvia had grown up accustomed to the routine at Hoover School. She had promised herself, I will be the best student I can be. Whatever school I'm in, I will make my parents proud of me. Dad, Sylvia said, Hoover isn't really so bad. Her father froze with a forkful of huevos rancheros halfway to his mouth. No, he said, turning toward her. It is bad. At Hoover School, no one expects you to succeed, to finish high school, to go on to college. At Hoover School, no one thinks you can make anything of yourself. They believe your future is in the fields. Sylvia, her father said, I want more than that for you, for all of you. Sylvia flushed. She didn't know what to say. Don't sell your family short, he finished. Don't sell yourself short. Sylvia knew her father was right. At Hoover School, the girls learned sewing and homemaking, and the boys learned a trade like fixing cars. Little time was devoted to reading and math and science. She knew for a fact that almost all of the students at Hoover dropped out before the 8th grade to work full-time in the fields or at low-paying jobs in town. This was not the future Sylvia wanted for herself. Now she wondered, can I keep my promise to succeed in a school where no one really cares if I get good grades or find a good job? After weeks of trying to convince people to sign his letter to the school board stating that Mexican and white children should go to school together, Sylvia's father had collected only 8 signatures. What are you going to do with the letter? Sylvia asked her father. She didn't think he would turn it in with so few names. I'm going to deliver it. It would be the right thing to do, even if no one else is willing to sign. Sylvia rode with her father to the courthouse in Santa Ana on the day he dropped off the letter. Just a couple of blocks from the courthouse, Sylvia saw a sign posted in a diner window. No dogs or Mexicans. The words made her feel sick. She was glad her father had spotted someone he knew on the street and hadn't noticed the sign. That sign is talking about me, she thought. Dogs and Mexicans and me. The sign gnawed at Sylvia all afternoon and into the evening. Before drifting off to sleep that night, she stared at the ceiling and thought about those 4 little words could hurt her so much. Then she recalled the hateful signs she had seen posted in town about the Japanese. Hand-lettered signs reading, Japs go home, and government-printed notices telling them that they had to go away, to leave their houses, and to go to camps. This made her think of the girl she knew only from a photograph and the few scraps of her life that were left in what was now Sylvia's bedroom. How did Aki feel when she saw those signs and read those posters? Sylvia wondered. Did Aki feel as hurt as I do now? Sylvia looked over at her dolls. Carmencita leaned against the corner of one shelf, and Keiko stood in the corner of another. Sylvia got out of bed and moved Keiko to the shelf next to Carmencita. She placed the dolls side by side, then stood back. How nice they looked together, almost like sisters. She rested Keiko's pale china hand in Carmencita's brown cloth one. It seemed right and good to see them so close. I wonder if I will ever meet Aki. Could we ever be friends? Chapter 6. Adversity is the foundation of virtue. Japanese proverb. Aki, Poston, Arizona. Aki and her mother crowded onto a bus filled with other families riding to Poston from the train station. Most people were dressed in their best clothes, men in suits and fedoras, women in dresses with gloves and small hats that matched their overcoats. Children stood hand in hand with their parents, everyone somber and quiet. On the bus ride, Aki took in the landscape. On either side of the road, she saw nothing but desert, miles and miles of flat, dry dirt. Off in the distance, rugged purple mountains cut a jagged line along the horizon and looked just as unfriendly and desolate as the desert. This is a lonely, awful place, Aki decided. She shifted closer to her mother on the seat beside her. Have you heard from Pop? Aki asked. Not yet, her mother responded. The post office isn't open yet. Soon. I know it will be soon. As the bus approached Poston, Aki saw what looked like army barracks surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Where are we? Aki asked. The Sonoran Desert, her mother said. Poston. Aki felt relieved that her mother didn't say, home. A uniformed soldier stood outside the front gate. He didn't carry a rifle, but he didn't need to. Even if we did escape, where would we go? The tiny blades of the barbed wire fence glinted like silver sharks' teeth in the sunlight. Her mother whispered, whatever you do, don't go near the fence. As they climbed off the bus, they were herded by guards through an administration building. When they exited on the other side, they were inside Poston. Aki tried to get her bearings. It wasn't easy because everything looked the same, row after row of slapped together wood and tar paper structures resting on concrete bases. There were no trees or grass, just dust and dirt. They turned right, walked halfway down the street, and stopped in front of the house that was about 100 feet long by 20 feet wide, with 4 entrances. There are 4 rooms inside, her mother said, for 4 families. 4 families live here? In this little space? Come inside, her mother said. Aki climbed several wooden steps and entered a stuffy room furnished with steel frame army cots, a table and chairs, a broom, a pot-bellied stove, and a coal bucket. Gray wool army blankets lay neatly folded at the foot of each bed. Aki counted 3 beds for Seiko, her mother, and her. We'll need another bed for Pop when he comes back to us, she thought. More wool blankets hung from the ceiling, dividing the space into sections, one for each of the families. There were no real interior walls. Where is Seiko? Aki asked. He's working, her mother replied. He got a job as a carpenter. He's getting paid, and it gives him something to do. Aki placed her suitcase next to one of the beds. She looked around the room and drew a deep breath. She didn't want to unpack her things. She wasn't ready to admit that this was to be her home. Not yet. Could we go for a walk? Aki asked. Look around. Of course, her mother said. Sunshine will do you good. A gray-haired woman with a straw broom was sweeping the next doorstep. Good afternoon, Aki's mother said. This is my daughter Aki, the one we've been waiting for. She turned to Aki. This is Mrs. Fujioka. She is from Sacramento. Her daughter and grandson live here too. Aki nodded. I'm pleased to meet you. Mrs. Fujioka smiled. Welcome. Aki followed her mother on a tour of the residential blocks, the school, the administration buildings, and the canteen. Each building looked just like the next. Will I ever be able to find my way around without a guide, she wondered. As they walked, Aki looked for Yuki's face. Have you seen my roommate from the hospital? She's here now too. Oh, honey, her mother said, this is a big place. There are thousands of people in 3 separate camps. You'll make lots of friends. They stopped by the latrine. Aki stepped inside and saw to her horror that the bathroom was an open room. There was a raised platform in the middle with 6 holes and no walls, no privacy. When they were back outside, Aki said, I don't like the bathroom. I know, her mother said, I don't either. Aki's mother pointed to a building up ahead. Now I will show you the mess hall. Mess hall? Aki asked. The cafeteria, her mother said, the place where we eat. Outside the mess hall, Aki spotted Seiko, who was waiting for them. He looked older. Aki squinted and for just a moment imagined that he was her father. Seiko threw his arms around Aki and lifted her right off the ground. Welcome home, little sister. Aki didn't like what she heard. How could this hot, dusty, cramped place without Pop ever be home? But she smiled and hugged him back. Together, the 3 of them entered the mess hall and lined up for dinner. Some people stood in a long line waiting for food. Others sat at rows of picnic tables eating their meals. Every face she saw was Japanese. The infant smearing food across his face, the elderly woman wiping the corner of her mouth with a napkin, the teenage girl whispering to her laughing sister, the child sopping up a glass of spilled milk, the mother cutting her daughter's food, the father scolding his crying son. So many people, she said. They're from all over. Fresno, Monterey Bay, Sacramento, Seiko told her sister. You'll get used to the noise. They collected their food on battered metal trays, then sat together at the end of a table. What is this? Aki asked, looking curiously at the toast topped with flakes of dried beef in a white sauce. They call it chipped beef, her mother replied, unfolding a napkin in her lap. Get used to it, kid, Seiko said. We have it a lot. Aki took a couple of bites. The salty beef and thick white sauce felt heavy in her stomach. She wasn't used to eating such rich food. She longed for her mother's harusame noodle salad and steamed rice. After dinner, they returned to their unfamiliar room, and Aki's mother helped her put her things away. She handed Aki a glass and motioned to a bucket near the door. If you are thirsty in the night, this is water for drinking. Later, when it was time to change her clothes, Aki stood in a corner, her back turned to the room. Seiko and her mother looked away. Without removing her dress, Aki pulled on her nightgown over her head. Hidden by her sleepwear, she unbuttoned her dress. wriggled free, and then slipped her arms into the sleeves of her own gown. Although her body was covered the whole time, Aki felt her face redden, embarrassed by the lack of privacy. Aki looked at the beds. Would it be okay if we moved our cots closer together? Kudasai, please? Of course, her mother said. I would like that too. Aki pushed her narrow cot next to her mother's, close enough that they could reach over and hold hands in the darkness. Mom, Aki pulled the sheet up to her chest. She kept her voice low and tried not to listen to the whispers coming from behind the blanket walls all around her. I miss Pop. Her mother brushed the hair from Aki's face. I do too. I don't like the food, but the rest isn't so bad. The beginning is easy, said her mother. The continuing is hard. Although it was not yet summer, at lunch she overheard one of her neighbors say that the temperature outside was more than 100 degrees. That's nothing, Seiko said. I've been told that the highs around here can reach 115 degrees or more in the summer. Aki wanted to think he was kidding, but she knew he wasn't. The government calls Poston's 3 camps Poston 1, 2, and 3, her brother said. We call them roastin', toastin', and dustin'. She wanted to laugh, but it was too hot even for that. When they got back to the room, Aki sat in the doorway and fanned herself with a copy of the Poston Chronicle, the camp newspaper written by the internees. Seiko and their mother stood outside, chatting with Mrs. Fujioka. Out of the corner of her eye, Aki thought she saw something move inside the room. She turned around and saw a large black snake slithering up through a gap in the floorboards. Seiko, she shouted, a snake! In what seemed like one swift movement, Seiko grabbed the metal shovel next to the coal bucket and smashed the snake until it looked like a flattened rotten banana. When it stopped moving, he scooped it up and took it outside. When he returned, Aki's heart was still racing. She smiled at her brother with admiration. What's a snake doing here? She asked. He lives here, Seiko said. We're the ones who don't belong. Aki knew he was right. She and her family belonged at their farm in Westminster. She belonged in her room, on her bed, under her yellow cotton bedspread. She thought about the Mexican family that her mother said had leased the farm. Was another girl living in her room, sleeping in her bed, going to her school? I want to go home.